Let us pray. Father, thank you for your holy word and what you're teaching us about David and his life. Thank you for the inspiration it gives us for our lives as we see someone who was not perfect, but somebody who loved you and how you used them to do amazing things. Help us to understand how that applies to our lives today, and may we seek to be more like you in all that we do. Now may my words be your words as we seek to learn and grow together. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. We've been talking about David during this period in his life, about how he was running and hiding from King Saul all through Israel, especially through the southern part of the nation in Judea, as Saul was trying to kill him because he was jealous of David and because God had rejected Saul as king and chosen David in his place, but Saul didn't want to give up the throne. So it was a difficult time, certainly for David, because he didn't know how God was going to work this out. And he couldn't just kind of sit somewhere and wait for something to happen. He had to protect his life and the life of those who were his supporters. I think one of the big things that we have to take from this is David was very, very concerned about not starting a civil war in Israel, where he'd force people to choose between him and Saul, because he knew that that would destroy the nation and it would make them weak, and other nations would come in and take everything they had and take their land. So he didn't want that to happen, but there was no peace possible with Saul because he was going insane. He was oppressed by an evil spirit, and so David just had to tough it out. It was not an easy time for him. If you look through some of the Psalms that he wrote, that's kind of reflected in some of the Psalms where he's crying out for God to deliver him from his enemies. And he was just trying to get through this time. Now, one of the other things, though, that David is doing, we find out from our scripture today, is that he was also trying to protect his people from the Philistines. When Saul's armies weren't doing their job, David and those who followed him acted sort of like, I don't know if you'd call it a police force or a militia or a National Guard or what term would be best, but he was out trying to drive the Philistines away from the lands of Israel. Now, not necessarily in big, huge battles, but there were a lot of skirmishes and raids by Philistine marauders that would come in and take people's flocks and their homes and carry off their families and things like that. They were harassing them. And so David and his men, which had now grown to a group of 600, were traveling throughout the land of Judea trying to protect people from this threat that Saul should have been doing but wasn't. Obviously, most of the people were grateful because they had this assurance that if I'm in need of help, the cavalry will come. You know, that thing you think of from the movies where the settlers are being besieged and, you know, you hear the trumpet blast and over the hill come the riders and they save everybody, they save the day. Well, this is sort of the situation that David found himself in with his people, and the people of Israel were grateful that there was somebody they could turn to help protect their lives and their homes, especially those who lived in southwestern Israel closest to the Philistines, because they were the oppressing people at the time. Our account today, though, brings something completely different in this context. The story of Abigail and Nabal fits into this time frame in David's life. It's when he's trying to protect people, trying to protect himself, staying away from Saul, trying to figure out what God has for the future. And in the middle of that, the author of 1 Samuel tells us this personal story about David's interaction with these two people from southern Israel. Now, chapter 25 of 1 Samuel begins with another significant event that happens at this time. We'll pick it up on verse 1 of chapter 1 Samuel 25. Then Samuel died, and all Israel gathered together and mourned for him, and buried him at his house in Ramah. And David arose and went down to the wilderness of Paran. This was a huge loss for David because Samuel's the one who anointed him. Samuel's the one who encouraged him. Samuel was his spiritual mentor. This was difficult for the people of Israel because Samuel was one of the people that had brought the nation back to God in his lifetime. He reorganized the priesthood. He got things set up for keeping the law, which they weren't doing very well before he came along. And he actually started to put things in place for when they would have a permanent temple. Now remember, at this time they still have this tabernacle thing, this group of tents that they use as their main worship house for the sacrifices and the other offerings. But eventually they wanted to have something permanent. Now of course that wouldn't happen until Solomon's time, but Samuel helped to lay the groundwork for that. But now he's an old man and he dies. Now what's next? David doesn't have somebody he can go to and ask and inquire of the Lord. Not that there weren't other prophets in Israel, but Samuel's the one who first chose him. It was also something that would probably have been difficult for Saul to deal with too, because even though he didn't always like what Samuel had to say, he knew that Samuel was God's prophet. Well, what does David do through this time? He basically got out of town. He didn't know what kind of reaction he'd get from Saul. He knew he had to protect himself and his followers. So he heads southwest to the wilderness of Paran, which is almost down at the Sinai Peninsula. If you can remember your map of Israel, it swings southwest Sinai Peninsula and then you hit Egypt at the southern side of the Mediterranean. So he was getting well out of circulation during this time to protect himself and protect his people because he didn't know what was going to happen. The area was southwest of the Dead Sea, so it was a wilderness area. There weren't all that many people there. Today it's mostly deserts. Back then we think it was more populated with grazing lands and maybe some forests and things like that. A lot of Israel today is still recovering from some of the deforestation and other damage to the land that the Ottoman Turks did over the last few hundred years when they were in charge of the land of Israel. But he goes down there and he's kind of hanging out. Then the story picks up and we're introduced to Nabal and Abigail. Now there was a man in Maon whose business was in Carmel, and the man was very rich, and he had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. And it came about while he was shearing his sheep in Carmel, we'll pick up this story in a minute here. This is not the same Carmel where Elijah meets with the prophets of Baal. That's Mount Carmel, which is further up north, close to the Mediterranean coast, but it's, I don't know, maybe 75 miles or so to the north from where he is. But this is another Carmel. Maon and Carmel that's talked about here are in southern Israel. About 10 miles west of the Dead Sea is about where they are on the map. And that's not too far north of where David is in Paran. Now we hear that Nabal was a very rich man, and obviously if you've got 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats, you're a pretty good operation, especially in the ancient world. And it came time to do the shearing. You know, the sheep grow their fur out, their wool out through the year, and if they're not sheared regularly, it gets just not healthy for them. Plus there is the value of the wool. Sheep shearing was done late spring, early summer, somewhere May, June, depending. And what it resulted in was a major festival for those who were doing this as a business in Israel, because it was like their harvest. You know, when the crops would mature and they'd go out in the fields and harvest the grain or the grapes or the figs or whatever, that was their harvest. That was their payday, because their hard work had paid off. there was a crop, they could provide for their family, they could sell the extra. The same thing was true for the shepherds, the flocks. The shearing of the animals meant money because they could sell the wool. Everybody wanted wool. It was one of the fibers that was used for clothing in the day. So it turned into a celebration, a harvest festival, if you will, because we could rejoice. We've got income coming in. The flocks are healthy. They've had a good year to put on fresh wool, and we're going to take it off of them, and we're going to be able to sell it. So that was what was happening as our story unfolds before us. Verse 3 is picked up, the story is picked up again. It says, "Now the man's name was Nabal, and his wife's name was Abigail. And the woman was intelligent and beautiful in appearance. But the man was harsh and evil in his dealings, and he was a Calebite." So we get a snapshot of who this couple is that owns this shepherding operation. Interestingly, names were always significant in the Bible. People just didn't say, "Oh, I like the name whatever." There had to be a significance. But Nabal actually means fool in Hebrew. Now, I don't know why you'd name your son Fool. Maybe it was sort of a nickname for him, we don't know, but that's the name he's given. And Abigail means, excuse me, my father's joy. So obviously her father was thrilled that he had a daughter. We're also told that Nabal was a Calebite. Now this may refer to Caleb from earlier in Israel's history, the spy that went with Joshua. But Caleb actually means dog in Hebrew. So this may have been designed as an insult. See, in ancient Israel, dogs weren't lovable pets. Dogs were wild animals that nobody liked. People in Israel didn't keep dogs for pets. The Egyptians did. Later the Romans would, but the Israelites didn't. So if you were called a dog in Israel, that wasn't a compliment. And that may be what's implied here. He was a dog. He was a miserable cuss. Abigail, though, we're told from the scripture, was both smart and beautiful. But Nabal was an arrogant, angry man who behaved wickedly. So the question is, how did these two get together? Why would a woman who's smart and beautiful want to marry some miserable cuss who's arrogant and greedy and harsh with people? Why would you want to do that? If she was that intelligent, she would have seen that. Why would she want to be with somebody like that? Well, think about it. This time in Israel's history, most marriages were arranged. There wasn't a dating scene. There wasn't a case where you went somewhere and met somebody at a gathering, and if you felt attraction to him, you started a relationship. There was none of that. Parents arranged marriages. I have a son, you have a daughter. I like your family, you like my family. We think that they would make a good match to bring our families together, so we will pledge them to each other, and when they grow up and are old enough to get married, we'll arrange that they get married. And the son and daughter had very little say in it, often. It was like, okay, this is what my parents want for me, this is what I have to do, it's my duty. If there was affection and love there, so much the better, but it didn't always happen. So it's probably true that she had very little say in the matter, that she was pledged to him and that was her duty to marry him. And she made the best of a bad situation, apparently. So verse 4, that David heard in the wilderness that Nabal was shearing his sheep. So word came down to him in Paran, hey, that wealthy guy up there in Maon is having a great harvest festival. He must have been the largest operator in the area because it got David's attention. So it was probably the largest festival. A great thing to go to. So what does David do? Verse 5, he sent 10 young men, and David said to the young men, "Go up to Carmel, visit Nabal, and greet him in my name." So he sends messengers to Nabal. He didn't want to go himself or take his 600 men with him, because that would have freaked him out, like, uh-oh, what's going on? Why are they here? He sends a small delegation, an official delegation from him to greet him. And sending a delegation this way was actually a sign of respect to Nabal. Verse 6, "And thus you shall say, have a long life, peace be to you, and peace be to your house, and peace be to all that you have." So they were to offer him a blessing from David for him and all that he owned, his family, his flocks, his servants. "May God bless you richly for everything you have and all that you're doing, Nabal." This again showed respect, and that there was no hostility, that Nabal didn't need to be afraid of David or anything, that he was just trying to impress on him that he appreciated what he was doing. Now, did Nabal deserve this? Probably not, but David was gracious in this. Then we go on in verse 7. "Now I have heard that you have shearers. Now your shepherds have been with us, and we have not insulted them, nor have they missed anything all the days they were in Carmel." So this is part of what they were to tell Nabal. In other words, he's saying, by the way, the reason that you are having this great harvest festival is because my men protected your sheep, your shepherds, your land from Philistine marauders. And when they were with them, they didn't disrespect your servants, your shepherds, and they didn't take anything that belonged to them. They didn't require any kind of payment from them to do it. He was emphasizing the fact that his men behaved honorably, and they were their servants in the sense that he was protecting them from harm, protecting Nabal's wealth. In verse 8, "Ask your young men, and they will tell you. Therefore let my young men find favor in your eyes, for we have come on a festival day. Please give whatever you find at hand to your servants and to your son David." Well, since it was a festival day, it was common for generosity. The more people that come, the better. Come on, we'll feed the neighborhood. God has blessed us, we're going to share that blessing. And they could do so because they had this great blessing of a good harvest, a good shearing event. So he basically says, we've come to celebrate with you. If you are willing to give anything to my men because of what we've done for you, I'll leave that up to you. But we're here to celebrate with you. Now, notice David doesn't demand anything specifically from Nabal. He just says, please give whatever you find at hand to your servants and to your son David. In other words, Nabal, we're not going to demand anything of you, but we'd appreciate anything that you could help us out with. And remember, David and his men are not living at home. They're traveling, they're on the road. They've got to get food, they've got to have shelter, they've got to have places to lodge, they've got to have water. So they're relying on the local people to help support them. They're not getting any supplies from the government, so to speak, because Saul considers David a traitor. They're subsisting on the goodwill of the people of Israel. And so he was saying, hey, can you spare a few things for my men who were there doing their job to protect you and your wealth, making your wealth possible? He also doesn't list specifically. He didn't say, I got 600 men. How about you sending me 50 sheep to butcher so that my men can eat a good feast, or something like that. He doesn't give specifics. He just says whatever you're willing to give. Now, when David's young men came, they spoke to Nabal according to all these words in David's name. Then they waited. David's delegation carried out his wishes and waited for Nabal's response. Well, a normal person would say, "Thank you for coming, guys. I appreciate what you've done to protect my flocks, my property, my servants from any kind of harm from these thieves. We'll do what we can to help you." That's what a normal person would have done to show their gratitude, especially if it was an abundant shearing that he had the funds to be able to do it without it causing his family to suffer. But that's not what happened, of course. Verse 10. But Nabal answered David's servants and said, "Who is David? And who is the son of Jesse? There are many servants today who are each breaking away from his master. Shall I then take my bread and my water and my meat that I have slaughtered for my shears and give it to men whose origin I do not know?" Nabal insulted this delegation from David, therefore they insulted David, and refused to share anything with them. He was ungrateful and he was selfish. And that was part of his character anyway. He also, we need to understand, seriously violated the laws and customs of hospitality of ancient Israel. These were very important, and you were obligated, if somebody came to your door, you were obligated to meet their immediate needs. Now, you didn't have to have somebody move in, but if a traveler came to your home, you at least had to offer them a meal or relief or perhaps a place to sleep for the night. That was expected. That was assumed. And here is Nabal saying, "I don't care what the rules are. I'm not going to follow them. I don't want to share anything I have." And again, it wasn't like David's delegation was just this group of vagabonds wandering around trying to get handouts from everybody. They were his protectors. They were his police force who had come through for him in a big way, and he couldn't show any gratitude. This is the kind of person he was. So David's young men retraced their way and went back, and they came and told him according to all these words. David said to his men, "Each of you gird on his sword." So each man girded on his sword, and David also girded on his sword, and about 400 men went up behind David while 200 stayed with the baggage. David became enraged with Nabal's response. "Why, you ungrateful, selfish, miserable cuss. How dare you insult my men after what we've done for you?" David decided that he must be taught a lesson. Now this is one of the rashest actions we ever see David make, because it was an insult. But David wasn't just going to go there and, scold him back, publicly humiliate him. David and his military troops were armed for battle. That meant only one thing: there was going to be slaughter. If he had slaughtered Nabal and his servants, no matter what the insult had been, then he wouldn't have had the love and support of the people of Israel, something he absolutely needed to be king. David to this point has been blameless. He has served Saul faithfully. He has protected his people. He's been a mighty warrior in battle. He offended no one. And now suddenly he's going to be this avenger of justice for some insult that this fool, I'll use Nabal's name, did to him. It seems out of character for David, but he did it. He was going to do it. But that wasn't God's plan, and this is where Abigail comes into the story. Verse 14, "But one of the young men told Abigail, Nabal's wife, saying, 'Behold, David sent messengers from the wilderness to greet our master, and he scorned them. Yet the men were very good to us, and we were not insulted, nor did we miss anything, as long as we went about with them while we were in the fields. They were a wall to us, both by day and by night, all the time we were with them tending sheep.'" So the report Abigail gets from the servants is, this terrible thing happened, and it shouldn't have been done to these men because they were nothing but good to us. They kept us safe at a time when we could have easily been killed and the flock scattered and stolen. And yet, because these men were there, we were safe. So Abigail gets word of this tense situation building. Surely Nabal had no right to treat them in this manner. But who is she? She's his wife. She can't countermand his wishes. She can't go to him and scold him and say, Nabal, you're wrong, because he's the master and she's the wife. So what does she do? Because she understood that something bad was going to really happen. David wasn't going to take this lying down. Well, the servants say to her, Now therefore know and consider what you should do, for evil is plotted against our master and against all his household, and he is such a worthless man that no one can speak to him. Imagine servants being brave enough to tell the master's wife how rotten he is. This gives you a better indication of how miserable Nabal was. But basically they came to her and said, Abigail, you're our only hope. We don't know what else to do here. We don't want to die. If David and his men comes, we're all going to be killed. And you're going to lose everything, and maybe you'll even be killed, and Nabal will be killed. What are we going to do, Abigail? We can't go to Nabal and try to talk to him. He's too arrogant to listen, because he thinks he knows better. This went well beyond just this situation with David being insulted and Nabal being a fool. This was a critical moment in the history of Israel. A critical moment in David's life. And also certainly all of Nabal's servants. Somehow, some kind of intervention needed to happen to avert disaster. That's when Abigail sprang into action. The scripture goes on. Then Abigail hurried and took 200 loaves of bread and 2 jugs of wine and 5 sheep already prepared and 5 measures of roasted grain and 100 clusters of raisins and 200 cakes of figs, and loaded them on donkeys. She said to her young men, Go on before me, behold, I am coming after you. But she did not tell her husband Nabal. It came about as she was riding on her donkey and coming down by the hidden part of the mountain, that behold, David and his men were coming down toward her. So she met them. Abigail quickly gathered a feast to take to David and his men, what Nabal should have given them. And she hurriedly went out with the feast and the servants to intercept David before he got to Nabal. Because if she waited until David and his men got there, it would be too late. She had to get to them while they were en route so she could avert disaster. At least this was her thinking. She trusted that even though David was acting rashly, he was still a good man, still led by the Lord. And she trusted that there could be some mercy still extended in this situation. Now, she did not tell Nabal what she was doing, because she knew he would try to stop her. She was willing to disobey him to save his life. Think about that, the courage that it took. I know that I shouldn't disobey you, husband, but if I don't, you're dead. Picking up verse 23, when Abigail saw David, she hurried and dismounted from her donkey and fell on her face before David and bowed herself to the ground. She fell at his feet and said, On me alone, my lord, be the blame. And please let your maidservant speak to you and listen to the words of your maidservant. Please do not let my lord pay attention to this worthless man, Nabal, for as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him, but I, your maidservant, did not see the young men of my lord whom you sent. So she catches up to David before he gets there. The first thing she does is she gets off her donkey and she bows before him, showing her submission and humility to David. Obviously, she's trusting David isn't going to kill her where she stood. but she thought she could intervene. She also took the blame for what Nabal did. She said, look, this is my fault. I didn't know your men came. If I had, there wouldn't have been this problem. And to prove it to you, here's what he should have sent to you. Here's the feast for your men. And she rightly described Nabal to David, even though it meant insulting her own husband. Again, she was willing to risk this disobedience to save lives. She also told David that if she had known David's men were coming, things would have been far different. As the lady of the house, she was probably in charge of seeing to the needs of guests and visitors anyway. So she's saying, if I had only known you were here, but the failure in that, of course, Nabal never told her. He just acted like a fool. And then she goes on, and she is being even more bold. She's talking to God's anointed, who's going to be the king of Israel very soon. And she said, look, don't take your own revenge here, because that would tarnish you as king of Israel. Please receive the gift and give your feast to the men, and be at peace. She praised him for his mighty victories. Truly he was God's choice and would be king. She let him know that she was a fan, that she knew he was God's choice, and that she would fully support him. God would deal with David's enemies, she advised him, just like Nabal, in his own time. God will repay. You don't have to do it, David. He'll take care of this fool. You don't have to take your own revenge. The only thing she asked of David was to remember her when the Lord did act. And exactly what she meant by that, we don't know. But she knew she had no future with Nabal, and she had hoped for something better. She realized the insult that Nabal did wasn't just against David and his men, but it was against God. So God was not going to let him off the hook. But she was in this marriage. She wasn't going to run away from the marriage. She was going to do her best to be a good wife and to be productive for their family and their business. But she knew that there couldn't be any real future there because God would judge him for his sinfulness. David's attitude completely changed after he spoke with her. His anger was abated. Abigail had refocused him in his calling. David told her to return home in peace. He accepted her gifts and her advice. The crisis was averted because she was brave enough and humble enough to deal with it head on. When Abigail returned home, Nabal was drunk at a feast. So she didn't tell him what had just happened, how close he came to death, because he was drunk. The next day, when he sobered up, she told him everything. Nabal became so frightened because he realized what could have happened to him. He went into a coma. 10 days later, he died. God had avenged David for Nabal's insult and his ungratefulness, because he also insulted God. God provided protection for him and his business, his family, through David and his men, and he couldn't even be grateful for that. So why should I let you live? When David heard of Nabal's death, he thanked God for restraining his hand and stopping his anger. He realized that if he had acted on his impulses, everything would have been lost. But because he trusted God, because of the advice that Abigail gave him, God worked it out, and Nabal was judged for his wickedness. And then he also sent a marriage proposal to Abigail. Of course she accepted and came to him, brought her, maidservants with her, and she became his wife. Now by this time, remember, David originally was married to Michal, Saul's daughter. But by this time, Saul had given Michal to another man because he was angry at David, considered him a traitor, so you can't be married to my daughter. He annulled the marriage as king and gave her to another man to be his wife. So David was no longer married to Michal. It would be nice if the story ended there and everything was neat and clean and David found true love and Abigail and he lived happily ever after and so on, but it didn't exactly happen that way. As far as we know that he loved her and she loved him, she did become a queen of Israel, and she actually did bear him one son. His name was later changed to Daniel. I forget what it was originally. But we don't know anything else about him, what he did in Israel. He wasn't part of the ongoing succession of David's throne. But it's also around this time that David took Ahinoam as a wife also. We don't know much about her. Just one verse, 43, says, David had also taken Ahinoam of Jezreel, and they both became his wives. She would give birth to a son for him too, and that's later in the story. Now David would go on to marry more wives and had several children. As far as we know, he had 8 wives total and somewhere between 18 to 20 children. His family situation would become increasingly difficult for him as he got older, and we'll get into that as we continue our story. But as I said, they apparently were happy together. She did give him a son, and she did become one of the queens of Israel. Now, because of humility and courage and wisdom, God blessed her to become a queen. Not bad from going from being an abused wife of an arrogant fool to being queen of the nation, or a queen of the nation. Not a bad situation. She will always be remembered for her willingness to risk everything to save others, even those who didn't deserve it. God used her to save David's future and the future of Israel. She trusted God for the outcome and humbled herself to become a servant of all. A great snapshot of who this woman was and what she did. And the inspiration is there of somebody who is willing to do what's right, to risk everything in order to protect others, those she loved, those she cared for, even somebody who didn't deserve it. And as a result, God blessed her for that courage by having her move into a royal palace. Eventually, not right away, because Saul's still around. But it's a great story of someone who didn't think of herself first. She thought of her own family and servants, those she loved, and she thought of her nation. She thought of her future king, and she placed all of them before her needs. She could have simply stayed home, claimed no knowledge of anything, or fled when David and his troops came and tried to hide somewhere else or whatever. But she didn't. She managed to change David's mind by her witness, by her testimony, by her wisdom. And that changed the course of what would have happened in Israel. We wouldn't be talking about David as a wonderful king today if he didn't listen to her. And of course, God would have had to go somewhere else to find somebody different to be king. And the lineage that comes through David, not through Abigail, but through David and others, takes us to Jesus. So things would have been completely different if she just stayed home. But she put it all on the line, and God blessed her for that. That's the kind of character we need to emulate. We need to trust God and do what's right, even if we take criticism for it. Even if those around us don't agree with us or would do things to upset us or even harm us. We need to do what's right, because God will bless those who honor Him. And when we're in a position like that, He will use us to do amazing things. So let's remember Abigail fondly, because she's somebody who's part of our story being here today because of her faith and her humility and her wisdom. Without that, who knows where we would be. Let us pray. Father, thank you for this account of this situation that happened, this contrast between Nabal and Abigail. Thank you that David was smart enough to listen, that he was humble enough to listen, and that she was willing to be brave enough to sacrifice potentially her own life to try to save others. We pray that you'll help us to be inspired by this story to do what you want us to do in our lives, and trust that you'll bring about the best outcome possible for us. Thank you, Lord, for this account, and thank you for how it speaks to our lives even today. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.